been named the new chair of the Armed Services Committee. We take you now to the National Defense University in Washington for a speech by Senator Inhofe on defense policy. You're watching live coverage on C-SPAN 3.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the arrival of the official party. Vice Admiral Rogi, NDU senior leaders, and fellow students, I have the privilege today of introducing our guest, Oklahoma Senator James Inhofe. He has been involved in aviation for over 60 years and is the only member of Congress to have flown around the world in his own aircraft. Over a long and distinguished career, Senator Inhofe has served the nation in the United States Army, as a member of the House of Representatives, and currently as a United States Senator and Chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Senator Inhofe, on behalf of the faculty and students of the National Defense University, thank you for coming to speak with us today.
My honor. Thank you. Okay, I will need this. I'm going to ask you to do something very special. I'm going to ask you to pray with me, all right? Will you bow your heads? Lord, we in the free world, and those of us, each one of us in this room, we ask you that you help us to use the great American for a model in our careers, in our lives, and for our country. And that is our fallen hero, George H.W. Bush. We ask this in Jesus' name. What a great guy he was, by the way. I'm sure that most of you, I'd be surprised if most of you didn't see the funeral yesterday. And he's had quite a career. I'm really glad to be here. This is the first time I've ever been here. I've been hanging around here for a lot of years, but I haven't been out here. And it's a pleasure seeing you and having the opportunity to talk to you and to, respond to your questions. I'm sure I have the opportunity to do that. It's fitting that we are gathered here. And I say this to, let me see a show of hands. Any of all the IMET students who are here. But come on, I know better than that. I can see by the uniforms. All right. Well, anyway, You may be shy. You won't when you get out of this thing. Anyway, you folks, you know about American heroes. You know about George Bush, what we went through yesterday. I'm sure you're watching. You know about Lincoln and Washington and all of our heroes. But there's one that you probably don't know that much about, and that's George Marshall. Yeah, he had more titles than anyone else. He had the Chief of Staff of the Army, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, one of America's greatest warriors and statesmen. And his words on the walls of this building, where we are, right here, remind us of the great responsibility placed on the shoulders of those entrusted with providing for the common defense. He said, and it's out here on your walls, he said, "We are now concerned with the peace of the entire world, and the peace can only be maintained by the strong." And this is true. He was the one who, after World War II, was saying that we learned at that time that we're going to have to be involved in the whole world, not just us. I mean, the fact that we would have be concerned about ourselves. There was a time when this actually did work. When we had, but now at that time we had two oceans separating us from our enemies. We had, and it was a totally different world. And so we let things slide a little bit, and we paid the price in World War II, and it was the greatest single calamity in the history of our country. And so we learned that. And the problem is we're getting, and that's what my message is this morning, we kind of slipped back into this area too, and it's but we don't have the opportunities we had at that time. Marshall, in his statement to the generation, believed it was time for America to head the defense of the free world, and to maintain the peace, America must be strong. And so, in the years that followed, America rebuilt its defenses. We rebuilt Europe with a plan that was called the Marshall Plan. You all read about that. It's something that was successful. And so he was a great American hero. We just don't hear about him. We're the fortunate heirs of the unprecedented peace and prosperity that Marshall had given us, our generation that we achieved. It's up to us to regain that inheritance. Doing so will not be easy, for just like Marshall did, we confront the challenge of preserving peace throughout the strength of the dangerous world. Today, our nation faces the most diverse and complex array of threats that I can remember. And this is also for everyone here to be aware of. Those of you who are senior officers, and I appreciate your being here, and I want to share with you that we got some problems out there. I'm older than all you guys. And I can remember all the time I was growing up, I assumed that we had the best of everything, that that America always did. And we knew the threats that were out there at that time. But the threats are different right now than they've ever been before. Because, and this is pointed out in President Trump's message when he said that we had our peer competitors, that's Russia and China. We know our peer competitors are out there. They are doing some things. It's actually better than we're doing it. When I look and I see some of the equipment that they have compared to ours, they've been busy. And we're going to talk about that. Then you go down to the next group, and that's the threats that we have from North Korea and Iran. That's another segregated area of threats that we're facing. And then, of course, we still got the Islamist terrorists. And they're actually, that's more under control than it was. But, for someone like me, I can remember the good old days when we had a country that was, we had two superpowers. And superpowers we knew what they had. They knew what we had. We had mutual assured destruction meant something at that time. They bomb us, we bomb them, we all die, and everyone's happy. This isn't the case now. Now is the case where we don't know what. It's not a superpower that we're worried about as much as it is someone who's not a superpower, who's out there, who has the equipment and the ability to kill us. This is something that was different than it's been before. So these are the threats identified by the National Defense Strategy, which offered a blueprint for preserving peace throughout and strength throughout the 21st century. Now it's up to us to follow it. And that's what this is all about today. And I just want to give you a few perspectives that some of which you disagree with. And I believe the decisions that matter most in preserving peace and defending way of life in the 21st century would not be made in Beijing or Moscow. Those guys, they don't want peace. Those decisions will be made all across America by free citizens, and that's you guys out there and us. John McCain believed that too. And when I think about picking up the torch that John McCain led to lead the Armed Services Committee, I believe that we must choose again to lead the free world. We must defend both our interests and our values. We must restore our military advantage against ambitious authoritarian adversaries. And we must strengthen alliances and try to reach out and get new partners. You know, that's a lot of what the IMET program is all about, to get people in here. And I have to say to my friends who are a part of that program, who are here in the audience, we're trying to expand that. You know, that's the relationships that are developed at this level. Once we have these relationships, we're friends for life. And this is something, if we don't do it, there's someone down in the Far East that's going to do it. So this vision will guide me as chairman of the Armed Services Committee and here at the National Defense University. Let me go ahead and do something that I wasn't going to do before, but to hurry this a little faster so we have plenty of time for questions, I want to do this. We have a 6-point program. These are what my priorities are as the chairman of the committee. First, we're going to use the National Defense Strategy to report as a blueprint. Now, this is very significant. If I can find it here. This should be, I say this to the provost, to the president, this ought to be required reading for everyone in this room, okay? This just came out. We had a hearing on this on 2 days ago. And this is, of all the reports I've seen, I was 8 years on the House Armed Services Committee, 24 years on the Senate Armed Services Committee. We've had countless of these reports coming in. This is the best, and we've all said this. It was put together by Democrats and Republicans. It was truly bipartisan. Every person on here was appointed by either a Democrat or a Republican or a House member or a Senate member, and so they're not afraid to come out and tell the truth. You know, everyone varnishes the truth around this country, and they don't let people know the real threat that's there. You won't like this, but we went through the presidency, Barack Obama, that's when we had all the problems in terms of what happened to us in our relative power with our peer competitors. This thing right here, if you read this in one area, they talk about some of the threats that we're facing, some of the conditions that we have in this country. And I say this particularly to you guys that are the military guys that are here and are attending here. This comes right out of the report. The commission, now this is the commission that we're going to use as a blueprint, assesses unequivocally that the NDS is not adequately resourced. They have, and this is a direct quote out of it, it says, America is very near the point of strategic insolvency. America's military superiority is eroded to a dangerous degree. America's combat edge is diminishing or has disappeared in the last few years. Now, it's not just, here's the bad part of this. We knew it. We knew it was coming. This is no surprise. You guys should have known it. You guys that are here, not necessarily some that came from foreign countries, but you were, because we saw this coming way back during the Obama administration when we had Chuck Hagel. And Chuck Hagel was a good guy. For some reason, we were never very good friends, but nonetheless, he was Secretary of Defense. And he said, this is a direct statement, he said, and when I read this out to real people in the real world, and go back to my state of Oklahoma, and I tell them, and I can remember I did this is back during the Obama administration. Chuck Hagel, quote, American dominance on the seas, in the skies, and in space can no longer be taken for granted. Then we had General Dunford. General Dunford says, we are losing our qualitative and our quantitative edge, advantage over our adversaries. General Milley, in terms of artillery, I'm very sensitive to that. I'm from Oklahoma. That's where all the artillery comes from. That's where we're doing great things out there. But he said, in terms of artillery, the Army is outgunned and outranged by our adversaries. And of course, we can't let the Navy off here either, because the Vice CNO of the Navy said, that was Admiral Moran, for our entire Hornet fleet, we have 62% that are not flyable. So anyway, we knew this was happening. We knew the problem was out there, and we had to start making up for it. And this is where it's all found. So anyway, we've got 6 priorities. The first priority is to use this as our blueprint for our conduct on the committee. And the second thing is to make sure that we continue to get our bills out. The authorization bill, that's what we do. That's the committee I chair. And to get it out early, because quite often it doesn't get out early. And we have to have it out, and we're committed to getting it out before the end of the fiscal year, which is October 1st. Now, we're going to do this. This is not a problem, because we did it last year. Now, it's true that I didn't take over this position till just a few months ago, 3 months ago, I guess, but I was also doing it on an acting basis before that. We got busy, and we set a record on getting our defense authorization bill out in, I think it's the quickest in 40 years. So that thing we're going to do. We're not going to have a problem doing it. And the reason we have to do that, we got to get out of this mindset of CRs. If we had a CR right now, it'd be a disaster. Talk to any of you guys here know that. And so we don't want that to happen. All right, that's the first thing. The second thing is to rebuild our readiness. A lot of people don't, talked about some of the problems that we're having, but we have other problems. When you stop and we think about some areas where we're not doing as good a job as our adversaries. Right now, during up to 2 years ago, we had of our brigade combat teams, we only had 30% of them that were working. We couldn't deploy them for maintenance problems. Same as with the Army aviation brigades. We had 25% of those that were working. And we had, as you know, the Marines used the F-18s. Only 30% of our F-18s were flyable because of maintenance problems. So you get this, and I'm critical, of course, of President Obama. You got to talk about these things. You got to, defending America is supposed to be the #1 priority. It's been my priority, and it is to most Americans. But now and then you'll get an administration where it's not a priority. We went through that prior to Reagan coming in, back when he had the Carter administration. We had it for the 8 years of the Obama administration. So we had to take care of that and correct that. And that's what we're doing. All right, that's the second thing in terms of priorities. The third thing is we're going to have to modernize the forces for the great power competition. And while we've been very busy focusing on the fight against terrorism, China and Russia, they've been rapidly modernizing their militaries, and unfortunately, they've been doing a good job. So we have a serious problem there. They're doing things better than we can do it, and America's military advantage is eroded in key warfighting areas such as power projections, cyber, space, electronic warfare, air, missile defense, anti-submarine warfare, long-range ground-based fires, and as a result, the nonpartisan National Defense Strategy Commission report released this month warns that America might struggle to win. Warns, and this is a quote out of this document here that you're required to read. At least, is that all right? Okay, that's good. We're going to do that. It says we might struggle to win, or perhaps lose a war against China or Russia. And we're talking about now. And this is no time to waste. We don't have any time to waste. We've got to restore America's military advantage. If we fail to do so, the cost will be measured in American lives, maybe some of you here. And that might have been avoided. It could have been a conflict that could have been avoided. So we need to prepare our Army for high-end conflict by reinvesting in areas like long-range fires, engineering, logistics, integrated air and missile defense. We need to modernize our Air Force fighter and bomber fleets, increase procurement for advanced munitions, and expand our capacity in lift and tanking and other areas. Certainly intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. We need larger and more lethal Navy fleet. And by the way, I was down in Norfolk all day Monday. It's kind of disturbing, and they're doing a good job down there, but that's the only place we can make aircraft carriers. And when we see what some of the competition is doing, and I sure hope I have this here, I have a chart that shows that we're within 2 years of China actually passing us up in this capability. Our aircraft carriers down there, we've had the Nimitz, you guys who are here familiar with this background. We've had the Nimitz for 40 years. So we decided to go with the Ford class. Great, Ford class, better in all respects, bigger, more lethal. And it works. We've had 750 of the takeoffs, landings, so we know it works. But there's a little problem. That is, the elevators that carry the weapons don't work. So right now, yeah, we can take off and land and all that, but if you can't carry ordnance, it doesn't work. And now and we don't see anything in the future, and yet we are looking at and thinking that there's a good possibility that we are going to. This is the thing right here. It shows that we started out in year 2000. 318. This is the Chinese Navy's ships. Right now, the lines are crossing, or were in 2015. We were at 271. They're 255, and they pass us in another 2 years. I mean, you know, it's not as if this is something the public is not aware of. And I hope there's a lot of public that's watching, and we're trying to communicate to them that we have to understand that we have a problem. We're going to have to fix this problem, and this is one area where we're going to do it. We need to modernize the Marine Corps, the amphibious vehicles, and the aircraft and maintenance service proficiency in expeditionary warfare. We need to invest in advanced capabilities in space, cyber, electric warfare. We need to accelerate our investment in key technologies like artificial intelligence, quantum science, hypersonics. Hypersonics, you know, a lot of people, everyone in this is probably the only audience I could talk to who knows what hypersonics is. And the thing is, we were passed up. I mean, I know that Putin lies a lot, so I don't believe this, but he said we have now passed up the United States in our hypersonics. You know, the whole new weapon system. You talk to groups not like your group, but people who are not familiar with it, and you think about what we can do. We've changed our how many hits per minute or per hour to a fraction of a second. And so we have these things that are happening in both China and Russia, primarily Russia, is making great headway there. So I want to underscore the significance of that to this group here today. The state of affairs is a predictable consequence of decisions made as the United States sought for years to reduce the role of nuclear weapons and to reduce the number of nuclear weapons. So that brings up another problem we have. You know, we've been toying around since the 60s with modernizing our nuclear weapons, our arsenal, and then we just quit doing it. And all the time we weren't doing it, both of our peer competitors were doing it, and they are making great advancements right now. As the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review pointed out, and this is a quote from the report, it says, since 2010, no potential adversary has reduced either the role of nuclear weapons in its national security strategy or the number of nuclear weapons it fields. Rather, they have moved directly in the opposite direction. Russia's nuclear doctrine emphasizes the coercive and military value of both threat and actual use of nuclear weapons. Russia's military thinkers apparently believe that they could de-escalate the conflict on favorable terms by conducting a nuclear first strike. And Russia is engaged in a comprehensive modernization of its nuclear arsenal. And, you know, if you don't really believe this, there's something you ought to read. There's an article in the March 7th, RAND, R-A-N-D, RAND, and it has an analysis of what in the event that Russia should decide to declare war on NATO in Western Europe, including our contribution to NATO, they would win. I mean, that's it. So it's there, it's real, it's not like it used to be, it's not like the good old days. And then there's China. If you want to be scared, look at China. It's also modernizing its nuclear arsenal, including seeking to achieve its own nuclear triad through the introduction of a nuclear-capable strategic bomber. So they're working on the bombers, the submarines, the ICBMs, and they are now saying that they are there. There's some question as to whether or not they've passed us up. I mean, China is a real force. I just got back from the South China Seas. I took 5 members of the Armed Services Committee, and just look down there and see what China is doing. They're everywhere. And the islands that they're creating down there, 7 islands so far. And everything down there, they're equipped with nothing but bombs and military equipment. It's our allies in that part of the world. I'm talking about the Philippines, all of them over there. They think that they are preparing for World War III. And, they look at them, all their presidents, all the things that they're doing down there, and they look at us doing very little, and they're trying to decide whose side they're going to be on. So anyway, you see them not just there, but all over the world. I've had a mission for many, many years in Africa, and so I'm very familiar with that. It happened that China didn't used to have, outside of its own city limits, they didn't have anything out there in the terms of a military operation. Now look at Djibouti. 7 miles away from our Marines in Djibouti, they're there. And they're as far south in Africa as Tanzania. So they are there. It's a scary thing. So the National Defense Strategy Commission, that's this document right here, described the combination of America's aging nuclear arsenal and our rival's vigorous modernization program as disequilibrium. It's not a word I use. I had to practice that one. It is not. But anyway, Russia is modernizing all 3 legs of its nuclear triad. China is completing its nuclear triad. Yet, according to some, America's response should be to get rid. We see this all the time. We need to get rid of our nuclear triad and hope for the best. Well, hope isn't going to do it. The United States must remain committed to a bipartisan nuclear modernization program outlined in the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, which is, the plan is not cheap, but at its peak, nuclear and modernization operations and sustainment should consume just, that we have calculated 6.4% of our defense budget. And that's an affordable price to pay for the security that we would get from it. So, let's get back to the priorities that I have. We talked about, there are going to be 6 of them. We've already talked about 3 of them. We talked about the Defense Commission report as a blueprint. We talked about the NDAA. We are going to do that. We're online to do that now. We talked about the second thing, rebuilding our atrophied readiness situation, and then the third, modernizing our force for great power competition. That's Russia and China. So the fourth one is caring for service members, DOD civilians and their families, the education of kids, the medical attention. Now, this is something that they have an advantage over us when I talk about them. I'm talking about the peer competitors that we have out there, because they don't care about people. They're expendable. This is a big cost, but it's one that we got to continue to do that, or we won't have a military. The fifth, the Senate Armed Services Committee will maintain its focus on defense reform, will conduct a rigorous oversight on the Pentagon's efforts to pass an audit. We're doing that right now. We hadn't done that before. But with that, I'm going to be able to, and we're going to be able to, and you're going to be able to talk to the American people and let them know that we're getting the most out of our tax dollars that we're spending. To adapt to a new evolving threats, we need to seek the time to award contracts and promote reforms. And the big reform that we'll always talk about is acquisition reform. You know, as I mentioned before, I spent 8 years in the armed services in the House, and then 24 years in the armed services in the Senate. And I can tell you right now, I don't remember 1 year we didn't try to do something with acquisition reform. I'm from Oklahoma. I'm pretty familiar with artillery. And we stopped. I remember when we were going to put together the Crusader. Remember the Crusader? We spent billions of dollars on the Crusader. Wham. And by the way, I have to say that as a partisan and conservative Republican, that was a Republican president that did that one. Then the Future Combat System, FCS, the same thing. And so this is something that we're going to have to change. And that's going to be a prime thing. That's our fifth thing that in way of a priority that we're going to have in the Senate Armed Services Committee. Now, all of these priorities require resources. So last but certainly not least, in fact, the most important is to discuss the sixth priority, returning to strategy-driven defense bridges. You know, the National Defense Strategy Commission, that's this book right here, warned unequivocally that the National Defense Strategy outlined by Secretary Mattis is not adequately resourced and that our nation is very near the point of strategic insolvency. Strategic insolvency, it's kind of a scary name. The commission has done our country a great service by courageously and clearly outlining the key defense enterprise challenges that we face, and it's a very tough and uncomfortable conversation to have, but to avoid it is at our own peril. So in 2019, I believe Congress' mission is clear. Until the BCA caps on lift the BCA caps on defense, eliminate the threat of sequestration. We all know the officers, particularly you lived through the sequestration threat that was out there, and pass an on-time defense authorization appropriation. Well, we're going to do that. But it's going to have sufficient funds to carry out our national defense strategy. It would be easy. All you have to do is make sure that everybody knows and government knows that our number one thing that priority in this country should be defense. It's something that it should be a no-brainer. People here with your orientation toward the military, you know what I'm talking about. The general public doesn't. The general public, a lot of the media is making them believe that we don't have any threats out there, and a lot of this is a waste of money. But I can tell you right now, with the things that we are doing, the priorities have not historically been there, and they're going to have to be there. Now, this parity, remember parity? We couldn't do, there is, the liberals in Congress, both the House and the Senate, say that you for every, and then of course this was the policy of President Obama, for every dollar he put in the military, you've got to put it in social programs. Well, now that's not the kind of parity we had. There's an old document nobody reads anymore. It's called a Constitution. And in the Constitution, they say that there's two things that are really important in this case. What we're supposed to be doing now, me as a senator, what I'm supposed to be doing here in Washington, we're supposed to be defending America and then infrastructure, where they called them post roads back then. That's what we're supposed to be doing. That's supposed to be our priority. And if we have that as a priority, we're going to be able to do that. To do that, we're going to have to do what we're proposing is to remove those areas that affect the military from the restrictions that we have. The BCA caps, I think, and I'm a conservative, and I've always been ranked in the top 3 conservative members of the Senate and the House before that. But I've always made the exception in those 2 areas, defending America and the infrastructure. So I was incredibly grateful for the partnership of our committee's top minority leader, Senator Jack Reed, in this effort, working together as Jack and I have. We should continue down the path toward a strategy-driven budgets that give the troops and sustain and sufficient predictable funding that they need. It's got to be predictable. Our contractors out there, it costs a lot more if they don't know from year to year what we're going to be doing, what our priorities are going to be. So we really feel that we are working together, and some good things are happening. But we've got to do is not repeat the mistake of the Obama years by returning to the arbitrary budget cuts. Remember how much he cut in defense. By the way, of the things, I'm trying to stay within the time frame that I have, but I want to tell you that if you forget everything I've said, or if you're one who doesn't believe that what we went through and that we're going to try to get out of, just remember this, and that is between the 2 years, using constant 2018 dollars, if we use constant 2018 dollars between the years of 2010 and 2015, write this down, our defense spending fell from $794 billion in 2010, $794 billion, to $586 billion in 5 years later in 2015. I mean, that's 24% reduction over a 5-year period, you guys. I'm looking for some kind of expression out there. There's got to be somebody concerned about that besides me. The media reports indicate that the administration is instructing the Pentagon to drop this down to $700 billion. By the way, when we got out of this thing in 2015 and made a commitment that we're going to start becoming competitive and start working in the right direction, things seemed to be working pretty well at that time, and we were able to make some changes. But and I can assure you, I spent the day before yesterday well over almost 2 hours with the president, with the vice president, with John Bolton, with the administration, talking about the thing that we're talking about right now, that we're going to have to give a priority. Maybe it's something like exempting military from the budget caps. There's a number of things that we can do. But the main thing is to make sure that we are going to be in a position where we can compete primarily with our peer competitors. And let me tell you, the president knows that. So anyway, there's no strategic rationale for any cut, but I do recall the words of President Reagan. He said, and this is a quote, he said, "There is no logical way that we can say, let's spend X billion dollars less. Anyone who advocates a percentage or a specific dollar cut in defense spending should be made to say, what part of our defense would you eliminate?" And he should be candid enough to acknowledge the cuts and what that would mean in terms of lives. Now, that's what we should be doing, and that's what we're going to be doing. And I know you hear these things. You got to keep in mind, if there's one group that knows this, that doesn't have to be told, it's you, and that is don't trust the media, because they're not going to tell you. They'll tell you what sells media. I've heard concerns that some in the administration, some actually in the House and the Senate, have talking about a challenge about talking about reforming our entitlement programs, which is something we could do. But they're talking about doing away with some of with the programs that we have in terms of our triad, as an example. But the threat is out there, and we can't let that do that. The threat is greater than it was in the past. So let me put in a plug before I finish up here for our president. You know, everybody hates Trump. You know, they do. They look at Trump, they don't like. Hey, I have to admit, confession's good for the soul. Every time I hear that what do they call those tweets? That a tweet is coming out, I cringe a little bit. Yeah, it would be kind of nice if he had someone to bounce those off and change the wording maybe a little bit. But how else can he circumvent a media that hates him? Now, if you stop and look at the successes he's had, you ought to write these three down, because you get in an argument. So you might even, you're probably, some of you in this room, among those who hate Trump. Well, that's all right, but you need to recognize what this guy has done. If he's done, number one, the military. We are just reversing what happened to the military. That $220 billion cut that was there, we're changing that. That's what we're changing right now. We're in the process of doing that. The judges, if you want judges, it's not just the Supreme Court justices that we know so much about, but how many in here are aware of the fact that he has confirmed more appellate judges, that's 29 of them in 2 years, than any president has done in a 2-year period in the history of America. He's done that. In the economy is 4% unemployment is full employment. And we're down there under 4%, and that's way down from where it was before. So we are really, and probably have the best economy that we've had in my lifetime. So keep that in mind. That didn't really fit in the presentation here, but you got to realize this guy's doing a great job. Now, when I talk, I don't talk as a partisan. I don't talk as a member of the Senate. Kay and I just had our 59th wedding anniversary. We've got 20 kids and grandkids, and those are the ones I'm talking about. You got in your room, when you chuckle a little bit and think that things are partisan, that's fine. You can think what you want, but you look at what the statistics that I'm giving you, and you got to realize that we're going to have to do this. So anyway, we've made progress in our readiness recovery. We've invested in modernization for the great power competition, and so I think we're doing a pretty good job at that. And I'm urging President Trump to consider, stop and look at it this way. We went from, after the last administration, we went into fiscal year 18. In fiscal year 18, we had a $700 billion budget. Now, keep in mind that went down, but that's still way below what it started out with 10 years before. We went down to, we in our fiscal year 18, a $700 billion budget. In fiscal year 19, a $716 billion budget. In a 17, and then in 20, fiscal year 20, the president at first announced that it was going to be a it was going to be a $733 billion budget. Well, if you read this book, it'll draw you to the conclusion that you agree with, and that is that we should continue for at least the next 5 years and have an increase in defense spending from 3 to 5% above inflation. Now, if you take this 733 that a lot of people think is too much for fiscal year 20, and you take it as a percentage increase from 2016 from this year, I'm sorry, 716 billion. That's a 2.1% increase. That's all. That is not even, so it's a zero growth budget, and we are entitled at least to that. So I realize no matter what the budget the Congress receives from the administration, our work will have only begun. With 2 final years of the Budget Control Act and no budget agreement in place, we're being told to expect the worst in the coming year, but that's not, I don't believe that's going to happen. So I believe that we all know that we need a bipartisan budget agreement for the last 2 years of the BCA, and I think that we're going to be able to do that. So forcing the Department of Defense to run on continuing resolutions or to endure another round of sequestration while we delay the budget agreement is simply not a good idea. You talk to anybody, I don't have to tell you this, because you who are senior officers here know what the cost is of continuing resolutions. And we can't continue to do that. And I think we're going to be able to overcome that. So I hope the Republicans and Democrats in 2019 will choose to spare our troops another partisan fight on defense spending. You know, I find out a lot more when I'm over in Afghanistan in a mess hall or in a field someplace from our kids than I do from some of the hearings that we have here in Washington. And they're watching what we're doing. Don't think for a minute they don't know what we're doing. They know who their friends are, they know who their friends aren't, and they know what the competition is. They know all about China and Russia and the threat that's being posed. So they're aware of that, and anything we don't need to do is send them a message that we can't get along and agree on a reasonable budget, and we're not going to do that. So I would conclude with that and just say that we're back to George Marshall again. He said, quote, "We are now concerned with the peace of the entire world, and the peace can only be maintained by the strong." And then there's Ronald Reagan, and we always remember what he said. He said that, you know, we need to modernize our nuclear activity and modernize our missile defense, because if we don't have it, we might have to use it. He's the one who said we want to keep a strong America, and we want to have all this capability so we don't have to use it. I'm hoping that's what's going to happen to us. So with that, I'll open it up and talk about anything you want to talk about.
I'd like to sit here. I'll moderate a discussion for us and build.
I'll sit there. You know, if you've been married 59 years, you learn to do what you're told.
Yeah. Good news is you've all got a copy of the assessment of the strategy available to you, and we set aside some reading days for you towards the end of this month to review that. So. Good.
So, you know, I really mean that. It's a great document. You'll know what I mean when you read it, because it tells the hard truth about where we really are today. And you don't get that just everywhere. And that's why I think it's very important, particularly for people like you, to be aware of it.
That's right. So I'd like to build upon a couple of things you brought up and a couple of points from the Commission's review. And to start with the budget, in fact, one of our colleges, their focus of their curriculum is on the resourcing the national security strategy. And the first time I talked to the students in this auditorium, I talked about a proposal to create a national defense university by George Washington. But the point was, great idea, but there weren't enough resources to support it at that time. And similar to what you just said, as a part of that, when President George Washington addressed Congress on his first budget, he said, to prepare for war is one of the most effectual means of preserving the peace. Very similar to what you were saying.
Exactly.
In the media, you've commented that $733 billion for defense spending is a floor, not a ceiling, and that's been widely cited. Mm-hmm. And you have also characterized past budgets as late, inadequate, and shrinking. Mm-hmm. And so I'd like to ask if you believe the military is on track to be fully funded and resourced in fiscal year 2020, and why are you saying that $733 billion is a floor and not a ceiling?
Well, yeah, the reason is, and it goes back to that report, it said for the next 5 years and probably beyond, and this is, everyone's in agreement with this. Dunford's in agreement with it. Certainly, the Secretary Mattis is in agreement with it, and that is, we've got to have a minimum of 3 to 5% increase in the budget after inflation. Now, we didn't really do that with the, I mentioned that we went from the old figure to $700 billion, $716 billion, $733 billion. But even if we go to the $733 billion, that's no growth. It's because if you do the math between $716 and $733 billion, that's a 2.1% increase. So I would say that everyone that we have asked in the committees that we've had, now granted they're all military, agree that no growth, you can't go below no growth. That's the reason for that figure.
Okay. So if past budgets were late, inadequate, and shrinking, what are the characteristics of our budget that would enhance rather than undermine both our readiness and national security more broadly?
Well, more broadly, I think it's the prioritizing. You know, again, I know I talked about that, and maybe I talk about that too much, but anyway, it goes kind of back to the Constitution of what we're supposed to be doing. And when I kind of jokingly talk about the good old days when we had two superpowers and we knew what they had and they knew what we had, and mutual assured destruction and all that, that's not the way it is anymore. And these people, when you have rogue nations like Iran, this lousy thing we did with Iran did nothing but shift billions of dollars to them so they could continue being the world's leader in terrorism. And if they have that capability, and they're rapidly gaining it, North Korea, they've already shown clearly that they can range the United States of America mainland. So this is the kind of threat that we have, and that's why my best answer to your question is you got to get that priority and that understanding that this is the most significant thing we can deal with today.
Okay. So we spend more on defense than China and Russia combined. So how do you determine how much we should be spending?
Yeah. See, you hear that all the time, and I know that. I suspect that you don't believe that, but I do know that a lot of people are saying that. You hear that on TV every day. Well, two things. First of all, they lie. We don't know. We don't know what they spend. There's no way in the world. Why would they tell us what they spend? And secondly, remember my point 4 of our priorities is what we're going to do. They don't have to do any of that stuff. They don't have to take care of their people. They don't care what happens to their people. I mean, it's a communist country doesn't care, and so we don't know what that price tag would be. And then thirdly, they have total control of what they do and what they report. And so anytime you see China doing, as I mentioned, what they're doing in the South China Sea, what they're doing in Djibouti, what they're doing in Tanzania, what they're doing around the world, throughout Europe, the Middle East, you know that they are spending, they're everywhere. And consequently, the best answer I can give you to that question is not true.
Okay. The National Defense Strategy and past national military strategies have placed a distinctive value on the importance of our allies and partners. So I want to shift to allies for a second. And our student population includes wonderful representatives of those allies. And given the scale, the breadth of our competitors, do you feel that the administration and Congress adequately recognize the value of our alliances in the architecture of our alliances?
You know, I mentioned that 2 days ago I had the opportunity to be with the President and the Vice President and their cabinet. That's almost all they talked about. you know, what we're doing, we're no longer, for one thing, our allies, I mentioned this in the South China Sea, whether you're talking about the Philippines, you're talking about Guam, you're talking about Japan, people kind of question that we have the strength to be good allies, because that's not what they see over there. As I mentioned, they see what China is doing throughout that region. And so I think we've got to have the allies. In fact, I kind of like what's happening right now with the 7 islands that they have created in the South China Sea, because people now, it's starting to affect our allies in that area. So I think this is something we can't do alone. But one of the big differences now and before now, if you look at some of the European countries and other countries around the world, they know that we don't have the resources that we had at one time. They know that we don't have the resources to participate with them. And so we've got to build that up, and that's one of the things that you'll see in this change in the distribution within the budget, is what can we do that is going to help us in these areas. Now, another discussion that came up last Tuesday in the White House was what are we going to be in a position to do with these allies? And there's some question is, how much of our funds should we take? Now, you know that they made a real effort in NATO, for example. They're trying to get them to come up. Well, they came up a little bit, and some countries did, and most of them did not. So I think that I know that the president will be criticized for some of the things he does against some of the EU countries, but he is doing that. We need them, and we want them, and they need us, and they want us. But they're going to have to come to the table to a burden sharing that is comparable to, not comparable to us, but supporting us.
We are the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff University, and one of the areas that he's asked this academic year that we look at is strategic deterrence, which includes nuclear deterrence, which gets back to something you brought up with nuclear modernization. And Mr. Chairman, at the Plowshares Fund event in November on nuclear policy, your soon-to-be counterpart on the House side, Mr. Adam Smith, said, "Number one, on nuclear posture review, we cannot afford what they're talking about." And he goes on to cite our $22 million debt, and that nuclear triad is beyond what we can afford. Others are saying we need to choose between nuclear and conventional modernization. And to state the obvious, I mean, nuclear weapons are not cheap, but are nuclear weapons driving our national debt, and can we afford to keep the whole triad?
Let me say this. We're two different people, two different philosophies. Mr. Smith and I, he's a good man. He's someone I like personally. We've gone through several of the big four conferences to come up with a defense authorization bill. In the past, we'll continue to do that. But I think he made a mistake when he singled out our nuclear modernization. Because as I read in that report, and that report is agreed to by all services, that's our number one concern, our number one threat facing us right now is what's happened to our nuclear capability. And when all of a sudden we wake up and we find out that we're dealing with something that was started in the 1960s, and the last major improvement that we made in that was in the 1980s, at the same time, I don't think we're even aware of the fact that our peer competitors were doing that. And as a result of that, that report comes out and says the number one threat facing us is the nuclear. So I think it was a bad choice, and I think it's one that he and I will be able to sit down and talk about. Now, as far as being a conservative, I've been ranked as a conservative. I've made it very clear in my presentation where my priorities are, and I'm hoping that we will. And by the way, well, I think that we're going to see, even though the Democrats have control of the House, we're going to see that when it gets down to the area of defending America, that we're going to be much closer together.
Okay. So would you believe we need to choose between conventional and nuclear modernization?
We need them both. We need them both. We got to have them both. And I can assure you there isn't one senior uniform in here who doesn't agree with that.
I want to shift to the great power competition, which you brought up, the 2018 National Defense Strategy. prioritizes great power competition with China and Russia as our highest defense priority. And the Commission report that evaluated the new strategy said that in the report that America's military superiority, the hard power backbone of its global influence and national security, have eroded to a dangerous degree. So what are the specific areas that you have with our military advantages over where Russia and China have eroded?
I think, and I'd have to go up there to the podium and get it, I have a sheet on the areas where China and Russia are superior to it. There are 7 major areas that we talk about. Here, let me just go up and get it here. I want to answer you right here. You know what? Okay. I would say areas such as shipbuilding and maintenance. Yeah. I mentioned that I spent Monday down in Norfolk. And so we don't have the capacity there. They are definitely ahead of us in that area. I don't think anyone questions that. Hypersonics. I'm inclined to think, and if this question were asked of me 6 months ago, I probably wouldn't give you the same answer. But now that we're seeing what they are doing in hypersonics, again, this is an evolution that gets us into another period of time. And it would have a huge impact on a ground war, for example. And I'm inclined to think that they're actually ahead of us in that. Electronic warfare, yeah, we were watching what Russia did in the Ukraine. They are, I think, competitive or ahead of us there. The triad, right now, they've done more for their triads, in all 3 of them. I didn't take the time to give the detail as to which legs of the triad but they're on all 3 legs right now. They didn't used to be. They weren't until recently, and China wasn't until recently. They are right now. Air defense, I think that people realize that. And then, of course, in artillery, Dunford's the one that said both China and Russia have U.S. outgunned and outranged. That's a scary thought. And you know, he knows what he's talking about. Yes, so, yeah, I think with that threat out there, that that's the best answer I can give.
Okay. I want to shift to Africa. So we brought that up before we were back in the room. And you've been one of the foremost experts and leaders in Congress on Africa and the importance of U.S. engagement on the continent. And so everyone knows he was the lead architect of the creation of the U.S. Africa Command. Mm-hmm. And our national defense strategy, as we said, prioritizes great power competition with China and Russia, as we've been saying. And both those countries are doing a lot more in Africa these days. In what areas do you see Chinese and Russian activities on the African continent that worry you? And what should we be doing to better compete against?
Yes, sir. It's primarily China. Because everywhere you go in China, there's kind of a saying there that America will tell you what you need, and China builds what you need. Now, keep in mind, they don't hire anybody in Africa. They bring their own labor in. This is part of their plan, and they do this. There is not one, and I'm familiar with things that are happening all throughout Africa. The coliseums that are being built, all the infrastructure that's being built. It's out there, and they are doing it. But there's not one that I can think of where they're not coming out ahead. Either they want their oil, they want their energy, they want something that they have that we don't, or that China does not have, and so they would be the ones that I'd be most concerned about. You know, what I thought you were ask is because it wasn't too long ago that they were talking about. And in fact, I think it was Mattis was talking about maybe making some changes and bringing some of our troops out. Now, if there's some merit to that, and I'd like to kind of drop this out there because something's going to happen. I'd like to have you at least have my view on it. We need activity in Africa, but the problem with Africa is too big. It's you have a problem in Somalia, and then you have a problem in some place. You go from the East Coast to the West Coast, and so if we had, and I've talked to them about this, an SFAB that is dedicated to Africa, we wouldn't have to have necessarily the troops that are there. Obviously, you have to have the ones, the Marines primarily, and the embassies. We understand that. But if you have it so that if something happens like in Niger, when it happened, we can respond to Niger, Zimbabwe, when we had to do work down there, Somalia. That's between those three areas, you're talking about far, it's like crossing the United States. And so that might be a better way of covering our interests in Africa than actually trying to have it populated within Africa, have it the dedicated SFAB to do that.
Right. That's a good strategy.
I might be wrong on that one, but that's
Well, I'd like to
necessity.
open up some questions for the National Defense University students. What would you like to ask them? Yes, over here on the left. I've got a mic coming for you right here.
Yeah, if it's from another country, I'd like to know, have them identify that.
If he doesn't, I'll ask.
Sir, Colonel Rode from Polish Armed Forces. Very glad to have you here, sir. 2,000 years ago, Titus Livius said, "Civis pacem para bellum," which means if you want to be prepared to live in peace, prepare to war. I'm also grateful that you brought George Marshall, which also said that you cannot compete basically by bringing more, but the same. So my question is how you see the role of United States in not only convincing, but encouraging the alliance to not only spending more for the defense systems, but to developing them and bringing new technologies. Thank you.
Well, it's a big world out there, and there are a lot of areas where you give a different answer to that question. Some in Western Europe that we've already talked about, that in terms of burden sharing. When you get, I was in Lithuania not too long ago, where they in their case, and in many of the former Soviet Union countries that are still, very strongly on our side, they want to have our presence there. And our presence there is really more of a vision that they want. They want to have their, it's fine when we go in, but they'd like to have us actually have dedicated people in those areas. In some of those areas, we're doing that. We're actually, John Bozeman is one of those in on this issue, trying to do that. So it depends on what countries you are in. I didn't get the source of the first quote that you said, who that person was. Did you hear that, Chancellor?
That's a Roman historian. He lived since 59 years before Christ up to 18 before Christ, and he said "Civis pacem para bellum," which means that if you want to live in peace, prepare to war.
Yes. And that's of course what we saw with George Marshall. We saw with more prominently quoted has been Ronald Reagan, because in order not to have to use during the time that he was in office, in order not to have to use it, you got to have it. If you don't have it, then you have to use it, and it's too late. That's exactly what he's saying. It's true. A lot of wisdom there.
Right here. Yeah. Go ahead.
Good morning, sir. Robert Lee with the State Department.
Wait, we need a mic down here.
He's pretty loud.
But, yeah. All right. Okay.
Good morning, sir. My name is Robert Lee with the State Department. Thank you for your comments and your service. You focused on the importance of defense in your remarks, and rightly so, as the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. You mentioned the need to protect defense from a percentage-wise budget cut in the upcoming budget.
Yes,
you mentioned the nuclear triad, but there's also another triad of sorts for national security, and that's the three-legged stool that Defense Secretary Mattis has talked about in terms of defense, diplomacy, and development. What are your thoughts in terms of the role that diplomacy and development should play in our national security, and whether funding for those programs should also be protected?
Yeah, I think it's very important, Mr. Lee, and I believe that my friends on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, we do talk to each other. We don't always agree with each other. My feeling has always been, yes, we need to try all the three legs you're talking about, but we need also to be prepared if it doesn't work. We have to. And what is the single thing that is most helpful when you are in a type of negotiation? It's the strength of the person with whom you are negotiating. So I think we're in agreement there, and I'm in agreement with my friends in the Foreign Relations Committee. We talk about this issue all the time. But if you're in negotiations on something, it could be a peace initiative, it could be anything else, you're always better off if you are the strength. I always remember what Phil Graham used to say back when he was serving in the Senate. He said, "We all lust for the days when the lion and the lamb will lie down together, but when that happens, we want to be the lion."
There's an Air Force Colonel in the back here. Go ahead.
Chairman, Lieutenant Colonel Tim Helfrich, United States Air Force. Thank you very much for coming in and talk to us today. I completely agree with your comments that we need to have a robust military spending, conventional, nuclear, but I'm also a little concerned about our near $22 trillion debt. And how do we increase our defense spending and the appropriate associated spending to a correct level without adding to that debt? And I think two potential answers are increasing taxes or entitlement reform. And if your answer is either one of those, I was wondering if you had a plan, or if the Senate, your fellow senators, are working on a specific plan to address those.
When I came in here, I had thought that I was going to be on for 20 minutes longer than I was, and one of the things I had in there was this documented thing that if we eliminated all our defense, we would still have a deficit. There's only one way to address that, and that is entitlement reform. Yes, I would be very supportive of entitlement reform. There are programs that people are talking about, but that's where the money is. That's where the savings is, and I don't think a tax increase is going to do that, but what we can do is reprioritize. When we went into the situation that we went into for fiscal year 18, we had to do something, and what we did is we gave a new priority, not as well as it should, because parity was still in place. We finally broke parity in fiscal year 19. So I would say two things. First of all, reprioritize where the defense is, where it has been historically in this country. And secondly, just flat exempt the defense spending from the budget caps until we get this corrected. And the only way to correct it, the best way to correct it, is to go after entitlement reform, and I'm one who will support that.
Yes, down here. Another Air Force.
Good morning, sir. Lieutenant Colonel Heather Fox, Air Force. So this question is going to be very similar to our previous one, almost a follow-on in a way. So I guess I'll dig a little deeper in that we've heard quite a bit about our resources against near peers, Iran, North Korea, terrorism, that sort of thing. But what concerns me more is this budget that's the foundation for all those resources we would need to fight them. So when we see statistics like our debt is currently at 78% of our current GDP, and if nothing changes, it'll be at 152% by 2045. Mm-hmm. With those kinds of numbers and the concern that if we do get to that point, confidence in the dollar or treasury bonds and that sort of thing could erode worldwide. Sure. Do you consider the status of our debt as a defense problem or just an economics problem? Thank you.
Well, yeah, I'd go back and say that you're not going to resolve it without the reforms of the mandatory spending. That's where the money is. The discretionary part of our budget is very small. And that's why I use the statement that if you did away with the military altogether, you still would not be in the position that we want to be in. So I would say it's got to be entitlement reform and reprioritizing. I have to give you the same answer as we gave this. And let me qualify something here, because I've always been, in fact, come to visit me in my office. I have pictures of where I've been the most conservative member for quite a few years in the United States Senate. I am concerned about that. Look, I've got 20 kids and grandkids. I'm concerned about them paying for stuff that we're doing today. And that's why we're going to have to get to a solution to the problem. You can't do it without entitlement reform. I'm willing to do that. That isn't my committee. There are different people that are working on that in the Finance Committee, the Budget Committee, but we're going to have to do that to resolve that problem. I'm glad you feel that way. I just am not going to do it on the backs of our kids over there risking their lives.
Yeah, right down here.
Sir, I'm Captain Stefano Galvetti from the Italian Navy. Sir, in the national security strategy, China is defined like as a competitor. Now you're talking about China as a threat. And also I don't think that anything has changed in terms of numbers or trends. We know very well that China ships are increasing and will be more than the US ships. But in terms of quality, it's another matter. They have very old ships and not very, cannot compare with the US Navy. So my question is, why are we changing from competitor to threat? What are the assumptions? What has changed between 1 year ago and now?
What's changing the threat from China from 1 year ago to now?
No, in the national security strategy, China is not a threat. It's defined as a competitor of the United States.
Oh, okay. A
so
competitor?
Actually, if I may, don't you think this increasing of the military could actually escalate, in a way, the tension between the two countries?
Okay, I'm not sure I understand what you're saying now. On sanctions, that's another issue altogether. It's one, I'm from Oklahoma. We're an ag state. We're some that have been punished by sanctions of this administration. On the other hand, it seems to be working. And you know, we over here, things are different in Italy than they are here. And over here, we've worked on this for a long period of time. And we've been at a competitive disadvantage for quite a long period of time with the Chinese in our negotiation. And I think that we can change. We could have a happy ending to that thing. In the meantime, you know, we have to keep in mind, I say competitive, yeah, but I also say threat. When I was making my presentation, I talked about a threat. I'm talking about China having equipment and resources that we don't have. In terms in some modernization, they are in areas that are areas where they are our allies, and yet our allies, such in the China Sea, they are sitting back and wondering, you know, is America really that? You know, who's the threat to who in that area? So all I can say is that I consider anyone who has anything better than we do militarily to be a potential threat. And my job is to try to minimize that.
Okay, thank you. We've got time for one more question from the audience. So,
this is where someone stands up with a notebook.
Yeah, right. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Army.
Sir, Lieutenant Colonel Dan Missisquoi, National War College. Sir, I'd like to ask you a question on the unique relationship between the Senate, the SAC, and the military, both from general officers coming up to testify on the Hill, but also staff delegates coming out to visit us in the field. What are your expectations? What do you recommend us as we move in our career where we get a little bit more of that interaction?
Yeah. There's a program that was started, I guess it was under the first Bush administration, that gives us people from the services. I rotate mine around. I always keep one. In fact, one's with me here in the audience today. And that is a great program. It's letting people in the military know how things are really run. you know, it's a shock treatment to most of them when they get up there. And, but it's great. And when they leave, during the time frame that they are there, I'm talking about the military fellowship program, where they'll come in for a year. You fall in love with them during that year. You depend on them during that year. And when they leave, they go back and they tell the truth about what the problems are and why. For example, they'll wonder, they'll serve in an office where defending America is not a priority with them. But they get back and where they can actually talk. I can't think of anyone who's going to be better informed. And there are probably some here in this audience that have gone through that program. We had, I won't mention his name, we had a president once that didn't like the program, didn't think it was good, and didn't think it was a good idea for the military to know just what's going on. I disagree with that. It's a great program. We'd like to have them have the dialogue together, and I can assure you that as one who is with me now who's going to be leaving at the end of December, he's going back much better equipped to defend America and be a good soldier than he was when he came in a year ago.
Well, Senator, thank you very much for your time. I have one question before we go. And we always, it's a very unpredictable world. Always caution the students about predictions in the future. But I would like to hear your prediction on the Orange Bowl.
Oklahoma's going to win.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Wow, that was great.
I wanted to make sure you guys met. Hello, Miss Sue. How you doing? I'm doing good. I was busy on my phone. Good for you. Well, I was forced to listen. I was pinching myself.
Like I'm asking.
I'm going to.
Well, I was stunned.
Wait, Senator would like to say hello to you. Please. Yeah. Well, he's have to do the backslash.
Yeah. He sounds important. You know, that was priceless. I'm not allowed.
Oh, I know. Communication. Yeah, he's an Air Force officer.
I have no idea.
He's been here for 6 years. I know that. No, but to be honest, got it right there. Also, that's wild.
This weekend on American History TV, Saturday,